The small town of Hollowbrook held a reputation for strange happenings, especially around Halloween. The locals never spoke openly about the macabre tales that swirled through the air each October, but they kept their children indoors, locked their windows tight, and tried to ignore the uneasy whispers carried on the wind. This year, Hannah and Mark, college students from the nearby city, decided to spend Halloween there, craving a different kind of thrill. They'd heard of the abandoned Harker Manor on the outskirts of Hollow Brook, a place that had grown into legend for all the wrong reasons. People say it's haunted, Mark grinned as he pushed open the rusted gate. One night here, and we'll have stories that'll last us forever. Hannah shivered, feeling the chill of the air despite her heavy jacket. The house was a hulking shadow, windows broken, its wooden boards rotting and splintered. She'd agreed to this only reluctantly, unable to resist Mark's infectious excitement. "This place gives me the creeps," she murmured, glancing around at the overgrown yard and dead trees. The wind rustled the dry branches, sounding like quiet skeletal laughter. Mark just shrugged and pulled out his flashlight. "That's the point, right?" As they stepped inside, the staleness of the air hit them like a wall. The faint scent of mold and rot hung thick, and the silence was suffocating. The foyer opened into a massive room lined with portraits. Old, somber faces stared down at them with expressions that seemed to shift, watching, waiting. "Look at them," Mark whispered, a hint of awe in his voice. "I swear their eyes follow you. Talk about creepy." Hannah glanced away, uncomfortable. Something about the house felt alive, as if it were breathing, watching. She took a step closer to him. "Let's not split up, okay?" Mark chuckled. "Don't worry, I won't go too far. I'll check the kitchen. You stay here and—" A floorboard creaked somewhere behind them. They froze. Mark lifted his flashlight, illuminating a dim, narrow hallway at the end of the room. The air turned icy, and Hannah could see her breath fogging up in the weak light. "Did you hear that?" Her voice was a whisper, trembling. "Probably just the wind." Mark shrugged, but his voice wasn't as confident. He took a step toward the hallway. "I'll just check it out. Just stay here for a second. I'll be right back." Before Hannah could protest, he disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps echoing and then fading away. She stood there, listening, straining to hear anything over her own heartbeat. The silence returned, and she could feel the house pressing in, watching her. Seconds stretched into minutes, and her anxiety tightened. "Mark?" she called out, voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. With a deep breath, she forced herself to move forward, following where he'd gone. The narrow hallway seemed to stretch on longer than it should, twisting in ways that made no sense. She clutched her flashlight like a lifeline, the beam shaking as she moved forward. "Mark!" she hissed, louder this time. A faint whisper drifted toward her, chilling her to the bone. "Hannah!" It was his voice, but distorted like he was speaking through layers of water. She picked up her pace, stumbling over debris as the hallway darkened. The walls felt closer, pressing in, suffocating her. She thought she saw something moving in the shadows, but she dared not look closer. "Hannah," the voice echoed again, weak and almost pleading. "Mark, where are you?" she called, panicked. "Help me." The voice was coming from a door at the end of the hall, barely visible in the shadows. She approached it, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. Cold seeped into her skin as she turned it, and the door creaked open. The room was empty, dark and desolate, with a thick layer of dust covering the floor. Her flashlight barely penetrated the murkiness, and she saw no sign of Mark. But as she took a step forward, the door slammed shut behind her, and she felt something cold brush against her neck. A whisper slid into her ear. "Leave or stay forever." She whirled around, shining her flashlight, but there was no one there. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, panic setting in. "Mark!" she screamed, backing away. A shadow moved across the room, stretching up the wall, growing larger and darker, a twisted, horrific shape with long, claw-like fingers that scraped against the wall. The figure's eyes were hollow, staring into her with a hunger that was all too real. "Hannah," it whispered again, but this time she knew it wasn't Mark. She stumbled backward, reaching for the doorknob, but it was gone, the wall behind her smooth and solid. She was trapped. Heart racing, she pounded on the wall, screaming, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figure crept closer, its footsteps silent, but its presence overwhelming. She could feel her strength leaving her, as if it were draining her energy, her very soul. A soft voice filled the air, familiar and haunting. "Why did you come here, Hannah?" It was Mark's voice again, but laced with an eerie malice, twisted and hollow. "Where are you?" she sobbed, desperate. The figure smiled, a grotesque twist of shadow and teeth. "He's gone, and soon you'll join him." With a last burst of desperation, she flung herself forward, her hands connecting with what felt like cold flesh. The figure dissolved into smoke, swirling around her, filling her lungs with an icy chill. She choked, struggling to breathe, to fight, but the darkness seeped into her, overwhelming her senses, filling her mind with whispers, thoughts that weren't her own. "Stay with me, forever," it whispered. And then she understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on those who dared enter, trapping their souls in a relentless, eternal nightmare. In her last moments of consciousness, she saw Mark standing in the corner of the room, his eyes empty, his face pale and slack. He reached out a hand to her, and she felt herself fading, slipping into the same void that had claimed him. When the townsfolk found the manor a few days later, they discovered only a few scattered belongings: Mark's flashlight, Hannah's jacket. The house stood silent and still, its secrets locked within its walls. But if one listened closely on a dark October night, they could hear faint whispers echoing from inside. "Hannah, Mark, join us." The drive to Edgewood Hollow had been quiet, and for Emma, unsettling. Her boyfriend Alex had insisted they spend the weekend camping out there, far from the noise of the city. The Hollow was known for its dense forest and strange tales, and even the locals seemed wary of talking about it, dismissing it as an old wives' legend. But Alex, always one to seek a thrill, had rented a cabin there for them. Emma, never one for ghost stories, hadn't told him about the rumors she'd heard of the Whispering Woods. It was dusk by the time they reached the cabin. Surrounded by towering trees, their branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers, the cabin seemed almost swallowed by the woods. Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as they unloaded their bags. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves, and the silence was almost tangible. Once inside, Alex lit a fire, filling the dim room with a warm glow. The flickering light danced on the wooden walls, but shadows still clung to every corner. Emma forced a laugh as they settled in, trying to ignore the prickling unease. After dinner, they sat by the fire, exchanging ghost stories. Alex, grinning mischievously, told her about the legend of the Whispering Woods, a tale that had been passed down through generations. Locals say that people who enter the woods hear voices calling their names, strange whispers that sound almost familiar, Alex said, leaning closer, his face illuminated by the firelight. They say it's the spirits of those who went missing, doomed to wander forever, looking for a way out. Emma shuddered, wrapping her blanket around herself. "Let's not talk about it." "Come on, you can't seriously be scared," Alex laughed, clearly amused. "It's just a story." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling. She could almost swear she heard faint murmurs outside, muffled and indistinct, as if the woods were whispering to her. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, the product of too many ghost stories. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside Alex, Emma awoke to a soft sound outside the cabin. It was faint, almost a whisper, but distinct enough to send a chill down her spine. She listened, heart pounding. "Emma." The voice was so quiet, so close. She sat up, her skin prickling with fear, but Alex was fast asleep beside her. She held her breath, straining to listen. It came again, faint and haunting, drifting through the stillness. "Emma, come outside." She felt paralyzed, torn between terror and a strange, inexplicable urge to obey. The voice was soft, comforting even, and it sounded like her mother's voice, her mother, who had died years ago. "Emma, please." It was impossible, but the familiarity of the voice drew her. Slowly, as if in a trance, she got out of bed and walked to the door, barely aware of her own movements. She reached for the handle, hesitating only when she felt the icy air seep through the crack. Her mother's voice was there again, stronger this time. "Emma, I need you." She opened the door, stepping out into the darkness. The cold wrapped around her like a shroud as she walked barefoot into the forest, her steps slow and unsteady. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The whispering grew louder, no longer just one voice, but many, voices she recognized. Her grandmother, an old friend from childhood, a beloved teacher. They all called to her, coaxing her deeper into the woods. Emma, don't leave us. Come closer. With each step, the voices grew louder, more desperate. She could feel an invisible pull, drawing her forward, guiding her deeper into the twisted maze of trees. The night felt endless, the forest stretching on forever until she couldn't remember how far she'd gone or how long she'd been walking. Suddenly, the voices stopped, and the silence crashed down around her. She stood in a small clearing, alone, surrounded by shadows. The air was cold and still, and her breath hung in frozen puffs. Then she saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hollow, eyes sunken and empty. They wore expressions of agony, their hands reaching out to her as if in desperation. One of them stepped forward, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was her mother. But her mother's face was twisted, drained of color, her mouth open in a silent scream. She raised a skeletal hand, her bony fingers pointing at Emma. "Why did you leave us, Emma?" The figure rasped, its voice barely a whisper. The others joined in, a cacophony of grief and torment. "You forgot us. You left us behind." Emma stumbled back, terror flooding her senses. "No, I didn't. I didn't forget you." The figures moved closer, their voices growing louder, more accusing. "You left us here to suffer. Now you'll stay with us." Emma turned to run, but the forest closed in around her, trees twisting and bending, trapping her within the clearing. The voices grew louder, overwhelming, filling her mind with whispers that echoed in her head, drowning out her thoughts. "Stay with us. Stay forever," she screamed, the sounds swallowed by the darkness. She could feel their cold hands reaching for her, pulling her down, dragging her into the ground. The soil seemed to open beneath her, swallowing her up as the voices closed in around her, suffocating her. The last thing she saw was her mother's face, twisted in a final, horrifying smile. When Alex awoke the next morning, he found the cabin empty. Emma's bed was cold, her shoes and coat still by the door. He searched the forest, calling her name until his voice was hoarse, but there was no trace of her, no sign she had ever been there. The townsfolk told him that the woods had claimed her, that the voices she'd heard were the spirits of those who had gone missing before, all of them doomed to wander the forest forever. That night, as he lay alone in the cabin, he thought he heard a whisper outside the window. It was faint, but unmistakable, drifting in from the darkness of the woods. "Alex, please, help me." He shut his eyes, the words ringing in his ears as he realized the whispers would haunt him forever. The village of Old Briar was known for its unsettling isolation, nestled at the edge of the mist-laden briarwood. Every autumn, a strange hush would fall over the town, and each October, like clockwork, someone would vanish without a trace. The villagers had grown used to it, fearing the woods with a superstition as thick as the fog that rolled through their streets. This year, however, two curious newcomers, Emma and Jack, ignored the warnings. They were urban explorers with a taste for the abandoned and eerie, and Old Briar's reputation had drawn them like moths to a flame. The innkeeper, a frail, sallow-skinned woman, eyed them as they unpacked their bags. "You'd best be careful," she warned. "People around here don't go into Briarwood at night, especially in October. The forest remembers." Jack grinned, brushing it off. "We'll be fine. It's just a walk in the woods." But Emma felt a prickling at the back of her neck, an instinctual dread she tried to ignore. That night, despite the innkeeper's cautions, they ventured out to the woods, lured by the thrill of the unknown. The air was dense with fog, swirling in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, like hands reaching for them. Leaves crunched beneath their feet as they moved deeper, their flashlights casting long, wavering shadows on the trees around them. Jack was chattering away, his excitement infectious, but Emma found herself increasingly uneasy. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. And then she heard it, the faintest sound of someone whispering her name. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, stopping dead in her tracks. Jack turned, his flashlight catching her pale face. "Hear what?" She strained her ears, but the forest had fallen silent again. "Nothing. Probably just my imagination." They continued on, but now Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fog seemed thicker, almost pulsing like a living thing. The temperature had dropped, and Emma shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. Then, out of nowhere, she heard her name again, clearer this time. A voice that sounded almost familiar. "Emma," she froze. "Jack, stop! Someone's calling my name." Jack rolled his eyes. "It's just the wind, Em. Let's keep going." But Emma's heart was racing. The voice had been real, soft, and desperate, and somehow she recognized it. She shook her head, trying to brush off the unease, but the voice called again, even closer. Emma, please, help me. It sounded like her sister's voice. Her sister, Lily, who had died in a car accident 2 years ago. A cold wave of dread washed over her, and her feet felt rooted to the spot. Jack, she whispered, clutching his arm, her voice trembling. That sounds like Lily. How can that be? Jack's face turned pale, but he forced a laugh. It's impossible. Let's head back if it's creeping you out. But as they turned, a shadow shifted in the fog, and a figure emerged from the mist. A small girl, her face obscured by her long dark hair, stood directly in their path, motionless. Did you bring a kid out here? Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Emma shook her head, speechless. The girl slowly lifted her head, and her eyes, black and hollow, met Emma's. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised a skeletal finger and pointed deeper into the woods. The look in her eyes was a terrible, pleading expression. Help me, came her voice, echoing around them, but her lips didn't move. Emma's mind raced with horror, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. The girl lowered her hand and took a step forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. Jack grabbed Emma's arm and whispered, "Run." They bolted, tearing through the fog, their breath ragged and their steps frantic. The trees closed in around them, and no matter how fast they ran, the fog thickened, swallowing their footsteps. Jack was gasping, his flashlight bouncing wildly, when suddenly it flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. "Jack?" Emma called out, her voice laced with panic. "I'm here," he whispered back, his voice barely audible in the suffocating silence. But in that moment, she heard something else, the sound of twigs snapping, footsteps too slow, too deliberate, and then she saw her. The girl, now inches away, staring at her with those empty, hollow eyes. "Emma," she whispered, her voice twisted and distorted, "don't leave me here." Emma's heart pounded as the girl's voice shifted, no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural rasp. "I've been waiting so long." And then as Emma watched in frozen terror, the girl's face began to change. Her mouth stretched, her skin paling to a sickly gray, her eyes sinking further into shadow. The figure grew taller, limbs stretching and cracking as they twisted into unnatural angles, bones protruding from its joints. The little girl was gone, replaced by a gaunt, spectral figure with a face of pure malice. Jack screamed, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her back. They stumbled and ran, desperate through the twisting paths of the forest, but the fog pressed in closer, almost choking them. They couldn't tell if they were moving forward or circling back on themselves. Every turn seemed to bring them right back to where they'd started, with that figure standing in the path, waiting. They ran until their lungs burned, until they could hardly stand. But just as Emma felt herself ready to collapse, she looked up to see the figure directly in front of them, reaching out with those elongated skeletal fingers. "Stay with me," it hissed. Emma let out a scream, backing up as her flashlight flickered, revealing the twisted faces of others peering out from the trees. Faces with empty, hollow eyes, mouths frozen in silent screams. She realized with dawning horror that these were the souls of those who had vanished, trapped within the briarwood, transformed into creatures that would forever haunt its depths. A hand grasped her shoulder, cold and unyielding. She turned, expecting to see Jack, but his face was now twisted, his eyes hollow and vacant. His voice came out in a slow, strangled whisper. "Emma, you have to. Stay." She shrieked, breaking free from his grasp, running blindly through the trees, her mind racing with terror. The fog thickened, closing in until she could see nothing but white, endless fog. Days later, the villagers found only one flashlight lying at the edge of Briarwood. Jack and Emma were gone, just like the others before them. But now, if you wander near the woods on a foggy autumn night, you can sometimes hear them, whispers drifting from the shadows, calling for help, begging to be saved, trapped forever in the fog, lost in the endless depths of the Briarwood. They called it the Witch's Mill. The decrepit, crumbling building stood at the far end of Black Hollow, hidden by gnarled trees and overgrown brush. The locals said it was cursed, that strange shadows moved through the tall grass around it, and anyone foolish enough to enter never returned quite the same. Of course, Clara and her friends, Ethan, Mia, and Lucas, thought it was perfect for a Halloween dare. They laughed as they parked their car at the edge of the woods, oblivious to the chill that hung in the air and the strange, pressing silence that seemed to fall over the forest. The mill loomed ahead, its wooden beams twisted with age, the great black blades of the windmill frozen in an eternal ominous stillness. Mia hesitated, rubbing her arms as she glanced back at the car. "I don't know, guys. This place feels wrong," she whispered. "Oh, come on. Don't chicken out," Ethan teased, nudging her with his shoulder. "We'll just go in, take some pictures, and get out. No big deal." Lucas raised his flashlight, the beam piercing through the darkness as they approached the mill. Clara, always the skeptic, pushed open the heavy creaking door and grinned back at the others. "See? Nothing to be afraid of. Just an old building." But the moment they stepped inside, an unnatural chill swept over them. The air was stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust hung thickly in the air, dancing in their flashlight beams as they ventured deeper, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The main chamber of the mill was dark and vast, with walls lined by strange symbols carved into the wood, twisting patterns that seemed to pulse and writhe when they looked directly at them. Mia's voice was barely more than a whisper. Did you hear that?" They paused, listening. Faintly, almost too faint to be real, came the sound of soft whispering, just beyond the walls, as if 100 voices were murmuring together. "Probably the wind," Ethan said, but he sounded unsure, and his grip on his flashlight tightened. The four of them crept forward, moving deeper into the shadows. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, each sound magnified in the hollow silence. Then they heard it. A quiet, almost imperceptible hum coming from somewhere below. Lucas frowned, shining his light toward a narrow staircase leading down. "Looks like there's a basement," Clara smirked. "What's the matter, guys? Getting cold feet?" She descended the staircase, her footsteps echoing in the dark. The others followed, shuffling into a dim, damp cellar with stone walls that seemed to close in around them. The humming grew louder, filling their heads with a low, pulsing sound that made their skin crawl. "What is that?" Ethan muttered, holding his head as if in pain. Mia looked around, eyes wide, and froze. "Guys, there's someone here." At the far corner of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadows. The person's head was tilted down and their shoulders were hunched, making them appear even more twisted and grotesque. Clara's flashlight beam flickered as she trained it on the figure. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't move. Lucas took a step forward, shining his own light, and nearly stumbled back. "Wait, something's wrong. That's not a person." The figure seemed to be nothing more than an empty cloak, its shape held up by some invisible force hovering just above the ground. And then, slowly, it lifted its head. The hood fell back, revealing a hollow skull, the eye sockets filled with a black, swirling mist. Its mouth opened wide, a bottomless, gaping void, and the whispering intensified, filling the room, echoing off the walls with an unnatural force. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, guttural, each word dripping with malice. Clara's legs locked in place as she stared at it, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might stop. We're leaving," she stammered, turning to grab her friends. But when she looked around, her friends weren't behind her. She was alone in the basement. The shadows seemed to stretch, closing in, swallowing the light from her flashlight until only a dim, fading glow remained. "Ethan? Mia? Lucas?" she called out, her voice a shaky whisper. The figure stepped forward, bones clacking with every movement, skeletal hands reaching toward her. She stumbled back, turning to flee up the stairs, but the door above had closed. She pounded on it, screaming, but her voice was muffled, swallowed by the endless darkness surrounding her. The whispers grew louder, layering over each other until they were an incomprehensible roar. 1,000 voices crying out in agony, filling her head until she thought she might go mad. She felt cold hands grasping at her, pulling her back, dragging her deeper into the darkness. "No, let me go," she screamed, but her voice was lost in the din. Just as the last sliver of light faded, a hand grabbed her shoulder and yanked her back into the stairwell. She gasped, finding herself face to face with Lucas, who looked as pale and terrified as she felt. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know. We lost you for a second, and we couldn't find the exit." Lucas glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wild. "But we need to go. Now." The four of them scrambled up the stairs, desperately pushing open the door and bursting out into the main room. But as they stumbled back into the open, they realized they weren't alone. The cloaked figure stood in the doorway, blocking their exit, its hollow eyes fixed on each of them in turn. The whispers filled the room, seething with an anger that seemed to shake the walls. "You are ours," it rasped. Mia let out a strangled scream as the figure began to multiply, its shape distorting and twisting until a dozen shadowy figures filled the room, each one with hollow, mist-filled eyes, each one reaching out with skeletal hands. They bolted, breaking through the side door and sprinting into the woods, not stopping until they reached the car. Hearts pounding, they piled in, and Lucas floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the mill without looking back. But as they drove, the whispers followed them. They could still hear it. Soft, menacing, seeping into their minds, filling every quiet moment with the echo of those hollow voices. And that night, as each of them lay awake in their own rooms, they heard a soft scratching at their windows, a whisper floating in from the darkness. "We are waiting." Each October after that night, Clara and her friends would wake to find strange symbols scratched into their walls, their windows fogged with words they hadn't written. And the whispers followed them wherever they went, always lingering just out of sight, like a dark presence that had marked them. And as the years passed, one by one, each of them vanished without a trace. The locals say it was the witch's mill calling them back, claiming those who had disturbed its rest. And some nights, if you stand at the edge of Black Hollow, you can still hear their voices, echoing in the trees, calling for help from a darkness they can never escape. The old Hargrave Asylum had been abandoned for decades, left to decay on the edge of town. The locals said it was haunted by the souls of the patients who had been mistreated, left to suffer alone in its labyrinthine halls. It had become a place of legend, a site for whispered dares and spooky stories told around campfires. But no one in their right mind ever went inside. That was, of course, until Ben, Carla, and Josh decided to break in on Halloween night. They'd been friends since childhood, and ever since they were kids, they'd talked about exploring the infamous asylum. Josh, the skeptic of the group, was always quick to dismiss the supernatural, while Carla felt a thrill at the idea of facing her worst fears. Ben, the ringleader, simply enjoyed a good scare. "Come on, it's just an old, empty building," Josh said, but his voice shook as they pried open one of the broken windows and climbed inside. The moment they stepped through, a chill settled over them, and the stale air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. They turned on their flashlights, sweeping the beams across the peeling walls where old rusted metal bed frames stood like skeletal remains in the dusty gloom. "It's cold in here," Carla muttered, pulling her jacket tight around her. "Just keep moving," Ben replied, his voice steady. He was determined to get them to the heart of the asylum, the basement, where the most terrifying stories were said to take place. They crept down the darkened hallways, their footsteps echoing unnaturally, as if the building were swallowing the sound. Strange shadows moved in the corners of their vision, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. As they reached the old nurse's station, Carla froze. "Did you hear that?" Josh and Ben stopped, listening. The silence pressed in, but then, faintly, like a whisper on the wind, they heard the sound of weeping. A soft, mournful cry drifting through the halls. Josh's face paled. "That's just maybe an animal or the wind, right?" But Carla wasn't so sure. The sound grew louder as they moved forward down a long, shadowed corridor lined with doors. Some were slightly ajar, revealing empty rooms with overturned furniture, scattered papers, and rusted wheelchairs frozen in the dark. Then, as they passed one of the rooms, Carla's flashlight caught something, movement in the corner. She stopped, holding her breath, and shone her light inside. A figure sat hunched over on one of the old, decaying beds, her back to them, shoulders shaking as she wept. She wore a hospital gown, its fabric torn and stained, and her hair hung in tangled, dark strands over her face. Carla's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you see that?" Ben and Josh looked in, their faces drained of color. The figure's weeping grew louder, filling the room, echoing down the hall. Carla took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Maybe we should go," Josh whispered, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. But Ben shook his head. "It's probably a homeless person or something. Just relax." Before they could say anything else, the figure turned slowly, her face still hidden by her hair. The weeping stopped, and an unnatural silence fell over the room. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting Carla's through her hair, and Carla's blood ran cold. The woman's eyes were empty, black voids, and her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that stretched far too long. Her voice, once a soft, sorrowful wail, became a guttural, hollow hiss. "You shouldn't be here," Carla screamed, stumbling back into Ben and Josh, who were equally frozen in terror. But as she fell back, the woman began to crawl toward them, her body twisting and contorting in ways that no human body should, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Run!" Josh shouted, pulling Carla to her feet. They tore down the hallway, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the labyrinthine halls, trying to find their way back to the window they'd climbed through. But the asylum seemed to shift around them. Every turn brought them to another dark hallway, another room filled with eerie, decaying remnants of the past. Doors that had once been open were now closed, and the floor seemed to pulse beneath their feet as though the building itself was alive, eager to trap them. As they rounded a corner, Carla heard it again, the soft, eerie sound of weeping, growing louder, closer, until it felt as though it was right behind them. She looked over her shoulder, and there she was, the figure crawling after them, her face twisted with rage, her hollow eyes fixed on Carla. "Please, don't leave," the voice echoed, but now it was fractured, layered with the voices of 100 others, filling their heads with a cacophony of pain and despair. Ben and Josh yanked her forward, pulling her up a flight of stairs, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They burst onto the main floor, and there, finally, was the broken window. "Go, go, go!" Ben shouted, shoving them through the window one by one. As Carla climbed through, she felt a cold hand wrap around her ankle, its grip like ice, burning into her skin. She screamed, kicking wildly, and managed to free herself, scrambling out of the building and collapsing on the ground outside. The three of them ran to the car, not stopping until they were inside, doors locked, staring back at the asylum in stunned horror. For a moment, everything was still. The building loomed in the darkness, silent and motionless, as if nothing had happened. Then, from one of the broken windows on the upper floor, they saw her, the figure, standing perfectly still, her hollow eyes fixed on them, watching. And though she made no sound, they could almost hear her voice, whispering in their minds, "Come back, don't leave me." They sped away, leaving the asylum behind, but that night, none of them could sleep. Carla kept hearing the faint sound of weeping, drifting through her apartment, growing louder each time she closed her eyes. She could feel the icy grip around her ankle, see those hollow eyes in every shadowed corner. As the days went on, Ben stopped answering his phone, and Josh's texts became frantic, full of claims that he could hear someone crying in his apartment, following him wherever he went. Carla tried to shake it off, but the whispers haunted her, the icy touch lingering on her skin. A week later, Ben's parents reported him missing. The police found his car parked at the edge of the forest, but there was no sign of him. A few days later, Josh disappeared too, his apartment empty, his belongings untouched. And every night when Carla lay in bed, she could hear them, their voices mixed with the weeping, calling her name, begging her to come back to the asylum. She fought to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder, consuming her thoughts, filling her dreams with hollow-eyed figures and twisted, impossible faces. Until one night, unable to bear it any longer, Carla returned to the asylum. She was found a week later, her face frozen in a look of terror, her eyes staring vacantly into the darkness. No one knows what happened to her, but some say if you listen carefully on a quiet October night near the old asylum, you can still hear her cries joining the others, a faint, sorrowful weeping, echoing forever in the haunted halls of Hargrave Asylum. The little town of Willow Falls was charming, in an eerie way. Every October, the entire town would gather to light the lantern tree, an ancient oak at the center of the village square, its branches tangled and dark. The story went that the lanterns kept evil spirits at bay, a tale whispered by parents to frighten children into behaving. But despite its grim reputation, most people dismissed the legend as old folklore. This year, though, the townspeople felt uneasy. The air was colder, the shadows longer, and strange accidents had started happening around town. Doors slammed on their own, objects disappeared, and people swore they heard faint whispers when they walked alone at night. But the lantern lighting tradition was sacred. So when the day came, everyone still gathered at the tree, watching as the mayor lit the lanterns one by one, the flames flickering to life in the twilight. Evan, a teenager with a taste for thrill-seeking, scoffed at the ritual, finding it all a little too dramatic. His friends, Jamie and Sarah, were equally skeptical, though Sarah felt a strange pull when she looked at the tree, as if something was watching her back through the tangled branches. "I don't know, you guys," she murmured, wrapping her arms around herself. "I get this feeling like something's off this year." Evan just rolled his eyes. "It's all in your head. Just a bunch of lanterns." "Nothing spooky about that." Jamie shrugged, but she felt uneasy too. It wasn't just the tree, it was the whole town. Willow Falls had an unnatural stillness, like it was holding its breath. "Fine," Evan said, grinning mischievously. "Let's do this. Let's sneak out tonight and blow out a lantern. Prove this whole curse thing is nonsense." Sarah and Jamie protested, but Evan wouldn't let up. Eventually, they agreed, though both girls were visibly uneasy. So, that night, under a harvest moon that cast an otherworldly glow over the town, the three of them snuck back to the tree. The lanterns still hung in the branches, their flames flickering gently in the breeze, casting shifting shadows across the ground. As they approached, the wind grew colder, and a low, mournful whisper echoed from the trees. Sarah stopped, her face pale. "Maybe we shouldn't do this." "Oh, come on!" Evan laughed, pulling out a small candle snuffer from his pocket. "It's a tree with lanterns. Nothing's going to happen." He reached up, standing on tiptoe, and snuffed out the nearest lantern. The flame died instantly, leaving a cold, empty darkness in its place. For a moment, nothing happened. The town was silent, almost too quiet. And then, slowly, a shadow began to ripple along the tree's trunk, like ink spreading through water. Jamie let out a small gasp as it began to take shape. A face emerging from the darkness, eyes hollow and vacant, a mouth stretched into a silent scream. Did you guys see that?" Jamie whispered, taking a step back. Evan swallowed, trying to laugh it off. Probably a trick of the light. Just a shadow. But as they watched, the face multiplied. More and more faces appeared, each one twisted with expressions of terror, their eyes black pits that stared straight at them. Shadows poured from the tree, slithering down the trunk and pooling around their feet, coiling like smoke. "Evan, turn it back on," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. "Relight the lantern!" Evan fumbled with his lighter, his hands trembling, but as he reached for the wick, the lantern flared to life on its own, its flame a sickly greenish hue that cast an unnatural glow. And with it came a voice, faint but unmistakable, layered with countless whispers. "You shouldn't have. Come." The three of them stumbled back, their hearts racing, but the shadows continued to move, stretching across the ground, reaching out with twisted, claw-like shapes. The voice grew louder, and the ground began to tremble beneath them. From the base of the lantern tree, skeletal hands emerged, clawing at the earth as if something were trying to pull itself free. Evan's bravado crumbled, and he turned, grabbing Jamie and Sarah. "Run!" They bolted through the square, but the shadows followed, slithering over the cobblestones, their ghostly fingers reaching out to brush against their legs, I swear high, ice cold to the touch. Every time one of them glanced back, they could see the twisted, desperate faces of spirits trapped in the darkness, their eyes begging for release. As they reached Evan's house, they heard the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. Evan fumbled with his keys, nearly dropping them in his haste to unlock the door. They stumbled inside, slamming the door behind them and locking it tight. But even inside, they could still hear the whispering, muffled but persistent, pressing against the walls. Evan's father, hearing the noise, came downstairs, looking annoyed. "What's going on? You kids look like you've seen a ghost." They didn't have the words to explain, but as they tried to catch their breath, a cold draft swept through the house, extinguishing the lights. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, coming from every corner of the room. Then, from the darkness of the living room, a shape materialized. It was the same face they'd seen on the tree, but now it loomed in front of them, its hollow eyes boring into them. Slowly, it extended a shadowy hand, pointing at each of them in turn. "You stole our light," it hissed. Before they could react, the shape lunged forward. They screamed, but there was nowhere to run. The room filled with shadow, engulfing them in freezing darkness, a void so deep it felt as though they were sinking into the earth itself. When Evan's father finally managed to turn the lights back on, he found living room empty. The front door hung open, a cold breeze blowing in, but there was no sign of the three teenagers. Their shoes were still by the door, their coats still on the hooks, but they were gone. In the following days, the townspeople searched the forest, the riverbanks, and every corner of Willow Falls, but Evan, Jamie, and Sarah had simply vanished. Some whispered that the lantern tree had claimed them, a punishment for disrespecting the spirits who lingered there. To this day, on Halloween night, if you pass by the tree at midnight, locals say you can see the faint outline of three new faces among the lantern-lit branches, eyes hollow and mouths open in eternal, silent screams. And every October, the people of Willow Falls gather once more, lighting the lantern tree and murmuring their prayers, hoping the spirits will be appeased and that no one else will be taken into the shadows. They called it the Mirror House. Hidden on the outskirts of town, it was an abandoned mansion with floor-to-ceiling mirrors in nearly every room. No one knew why the original owners had installed so many mirrors, but rumor had it that they were obsessed with reflections, convinced that mirrors were windows to other worlds. The house had been empty for years, but locals avoided it. They swore that sometimes, when you glanced into one of its dusty windows, you'd see someone staring back who looked like you, but wasn't. For Halloween, Danny, Claire, and her younger brother Liam decided to explore the Mirror House. They'd heard the stories and dared each other to spend a few hours inside. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they crept through the broken iron gate and up the cracked stone path leading to the front door. Inside, the house was silent, its rooms filled with eerie reflections. Every wall was lined with mirrors, all covered in a thin layer of dust that dulled their shine. The three friends huddled close together, feeling watched by the dozens of reflections that surrounded them. Claire shivered, glancing at herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked back, pale and anxious. "This place gives me the creeps. It's like, I don't know, like the mirrors are staring back." Danny scoffed, but even he looked uncomfortable. "They're just reflections. Let's get some photos and head back. We'll laugh about this tomorrow." As they walked deeper into the house, the mirrors seemed to stretch, showing their reflections at odd angles, making their bodies appear twisted and elongated. Liam, fascinated, wandered over to a full-length mirror by the staircase. "Look at this," he called. "It's like I'm looking at myself in another room." Danny and Claire joined him, staring into the mirror. The reflection was off. Their faces looked wrong, slightly warped, and their eyes seemed too dark. Just as Danny raised his phone to snap a picture, the reflections blinked. Did you guys see that?" Claire whispered, stepping back. They all froze. The reflections stared back, unblinking, and then, slowly, their mirror images began to smile. Cold, unnatural smiles that didn't match their faces at all. "Let's go," Liam muttered, backing away. But as they turned to leave, Danny gasped, pointing at the mirror. "Wait, they're not moving with us." Claire looked back. The reflections were still standing there, grinning, even as they backed away, her stomach twisted with fear. Then, one by one, the reflections stepped forward, pressing their hands against the glass, eyes gleaming with a dark, sinister light. The friends froze, unable to look away as the reflections pressed harder, their hands pushing against the glass as if they were trying to break through. "Run!" Danny shouted, grabbing Liam and Claire and yanking them toward the front door. But as they fled, the mirrors lining the hallway began to ripple, and their reflections inside turned to watch them, faces twisted with a disturbing intensity. They raced through the house, but every hallway seemed to lead them back to the entrance hall with the towering mirrors. The house seemed alive, guiding them, trapping them. Panic set in as they realized they were lost, the same distorted reflections watching them from every corner. Desperate, Danny turned to a side door, hoping for an exit, but instead they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room with a single mirror on the wall. This one looked older, more polished, as though it had been recently cleaned. The three of them stared, feeling a strange pull toward it. In the reflection, they saw their doubles standing silently, waiting. But this time, something was different. The reflections were moving independently, grinning as they stepped back, beckoning with slow, jerking movements for Danny, Claire, and Liam to come closer. "I don't want to look anymore," Liam whimpered, his voice shaking. Claire tried to pull him away, but Danny was transfixed, inching closer to the mirror. What "What do you think happens if we touch it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Don't even think about it," Claire cried, tugging on his arm. But Danny reached out, fingers trembling as he touched the surface. The glass was cold, colder than ice, and his hands sank slightly as though it were touching water. With a sudden, violent tug, the reflection of Danny grabbed his wrist and pulled, yanking him forward until his entire arm was inside the glass. He screamed, struggling, but the grip on the other side was too strong. "Help me!" Danny shouted, his face pale with terror. Claire and Liam grabbed onto him, pulling as hard as they could, but it was like the mirror was swallowing him whole. Bit by bit, his arm, shoulder, and chest sank into the glass. His face disappeared last, eyes wide with terror as he was pulled into the mirror's dark depths. When Danny was gone, Claire and Liam staggered back, panting. They stared at the mirror, horrified, but Danny's reflection was still there, his face pressed against the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. "No, no, no!" Claire whispered, pulling Liam close. But when she looked at their own reflections, they too had changed. Their reflections were grinning widely, eyes dark, their heads tilting in unnatural jerking motions, and slowly they raised their hands, tapping against the glass as if signaling their impatience. Then, in a raspy voice that sounded distant and muffled, Claire's reflection whispered, "Your turn." Liam grabbed Claire's hand, pulling her toward the door, but just as they reached it, the mirrors around them rippled, and their reflections stepped out. The creatures wore their faces, but twisted and wrong, like mockeries of who they were. The mirrored versions blocked their path, smiling their unnatural grins. Claire and Liam tried to back away, but everywhere they turned, a distorted version of themselves stood waiting. The air grew colder, the room darkening as the mirror creatures closed in, cornering them. "No, stay back!" Claire screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. The last thing she saw was her own face, grinning widely, reaching out to pull her into the glass. The next morning, the mirror house stood silent, its hallways still and empty. If you looked closely, though, you might see something strange in one of the mirrors. A faint outline of three faces, mouths open in silent screams, forever trapped in the cold, dark glass. No one ever saw Danny, Claire, or Liam again. But some say on quiet nights, if you pass by the old mansion, you can hear the faint sound of knocking from inside the mirrors, desperate and endless, as if someone or something is trying to break free. It was the last Halloween shift Abby ever planned to take at Lakeview Mortuary. She needed the overtime, but that didn't stop her from feeling an unsettling chill as she stepped into the cold, echoing building. Lakeview had a reputation among the locals. Old-timers claimed that if you worked there late enough, you'd catch glimpses of lingering souls. Abby didn't buy into those stories, but the empty halls still unsettled her. Her shift was supposed to be quiet. A simple inventory check of the equipment in the preparation room, then a final sign-off. Just a few hours. But when she flicked on the lights in the embalming room, her blood froze. There was a body on the slab wrapped in a white sheet. She hadn't received any calls about a new arrival. Abby glanced at the tag clipped to the sheet. No name, just a single letter X, written in a spidery scrawl. Her nerves prickled. Strange, she thought, but maybe there had been a mistake. She decided she'd leave it for her supervisor in the morning. But as she turned to leave, a soft whisper filled the room. "Stay, please." Abby whipped around, heart pounding. The mortuary was empty. She was the only one here. She tried to laugh it off, assuming her tired mind was playing tricks on her. She continued down the hall, her footsteps echoing as she moved to the supply closet. But just as she opened the door, a cold draft swept down the hall, and the lights flickered. She froze. Abby. Her name came as a breath, a chill whisper that drifted from the embalming room. Every hair on her neck rose. The voice was soft but unmistakable. It wasn't her imagination. She didn't dare move for a full minute until the mortuary fell silent again. Finally, she took a deep breath, talking herself down. "Get a grip, Abby. It's an old building." But something compelled her to return to the room, almost like a pull that she couldn't resist. Back in the embalming room, she approached the covered body. "Maybe this is all in my head," she told herself, peeling back the sheet to reveal the face beneath. Her blood ran cold. The man on the slab had deep, glassy eyes, wide open, staring straight at her. His skin was ashen, a waxy pallor. But what sent her heart hammering was the man's expression, A horrible, frozen grin stretched across his face, lips pulled tight over yellowed teeth, as though he died while laughing in terrible pain. As she stumbled backward, she tripped over the edge of the metal table. Her hand caught the edge of the sheet, pulling it slightly to reveal a tattoo on the man's wrist, a strange symbol of a twisted infinity loop marked in deep black ink. The shape looked almost like it was writhing, shifting as she stared. Without thinking, she reached out to touch it. The second her fingers brushed his wrist, a deep, rumbling laugh filled the air. It echoed off the walls, guttural and inhuman. Abby's heart thundered. She dropped the sheet and backed toward the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. But then the door closed on its own, clicking shut with a finality that sent panic flaring through her chest. The lights dimmed, flickering as a cold fog began to spread across the floor. The man's face remained frozen in that terrible grin, but his eyes tracked her, slowly moving to lock onto hers. Why? Did you wake me? The corpse rasped, its jaw moving slowly as though it hadn't spoken in years. Abby clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming, her eyes darting around the room for any way out. The walls seemed to close in, the cold seeping through her skin, paralyzing her with fear. You released me, the voice hissed, though the corpse's mouth barely moved. I was bound, but now... His head turned with an unnatural creak, the grin widening until it looked like his face might split open. Now I'm free to wander. No, she whispered, trembling, backing away. She reached the door and pulled with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. Her eyes flicked back to the corpse, now sitting up, grinning with a hunger that made her skin crawl. Abby's only thought was to run, but as she stumbled back, her flashlight dropped and spun, casting shadows across the walls. The fog thickened, swirling around her feet, and in it she saw shapes, twisting, wraith-like figures, silent, watching her with hollow eyes. Abby, the corpse rasped, his voice somehow echoing inside her mind. You'll stay with us. She yanked on the door, desperate, but it held firm, as if locked from the other side. She banged her fists against it, but the sound was swallowed by the fog, and she knew no one outside could hear her. Then, one of the wraith-like figures moved closer, stretching an elongated hand toward her. It was transparent, but solid enough to cast a faint shadow, and as its hand brushed her shoulder, she felt a deathly chill seep into her bones. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. A sudden, violent wind blew through the room, whipping her hair around her face and extinguishing the dim light. In the darkness, she felt the cold figures circling her, their silent whispers echoing like a chant. Stay with us. Stay forever. The man on the slab reached out, his hand closing over hers with an iron grip. His skin was like ice, pressing against her wrist, the twisted infinity tattoo burning into her skin. She could feel the symbol throbbing, its mark etching into her flesh. You freed me, he whispered, his dead eyes boring into hers. Now you're bound in my place. Abby felt a wave of dread as his hand tightened, pulling her down toward him. Her body felt like it was sinking, her vision blurring as the fog thickened, swirling around her. No, please, she begged, but her voice was swallowed by the dark, her consciousness slipping as coldness seeped into every part of her. When the mortuary supervisor arrived the next morning, he found Abby lying on the slab in the embalming room, her eyes wide open, a twisted grin frozen on her face, and on her wrist a fresh black tattoo in the shape of an infinity loop. Rumor has it that if you go into the embalming room late at night, you might catch a glimpse of Abby in the mirrors, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes staring as if begging to be freed. But no one in Lakeview Mortuary ever takes the night shift anymore, and no one dares look too long into the mirrors in case she, or whatever else lurks there, looks back. The legend of Hollowbrook Bridge wasn't something most people spoke of out loud, especially not in the quiet little town where it was whispered about in only the darkest corners. But every Halloween, a dare would circulate among the local teens. Cross the bridge at midnight, stand in the middle, and look over the edge. If you looked long enough, it was said, you'd see the Lady of the Lake, a spectral figure known for luring unsuspecting souls into the depths of Hollowbrook. Nobody had ever really stayed on the bridge long enough to find out if she was real, at least not in recent memory. But on Halloween night, Jason, Lucas, and Anna decided to break that record. The three of them ventured out, armed with flashlights and a GoPro, excited and laughing to shake off the chill they felt from the stories. The bridge was dark and silent, and the moonlight barely cut through the dense trees surrounding them. The hollow echo of their footsteps against the old, creaky wood added an eerie soundtrack to their adventure. Anna, ever the skeptic, walked to the center of the bridge and turned to face the water below. So, what? We just stand here and wait? Wait? Jason grinned, nudging Lucas. Legend says if you stand here and call her name 3 times, she'll appear. That's when you're supposed to look over the edge. Lucas shifted nervously, glancing over the bridge's edge at the murky water below. And what happens if she does appear? Jason just shrugged. I guess she takes you. Anna rolled her eyes. Ghosts don't exist, Jason. I'm going to call her out right now. She took a deep breath, cupping her hands around her mouth. Lady of the Lake, Lady of the Lake, Lady of the Lake. For a moment, only the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of the water could be heard. The 3 of them stood in silence, their breath visible in the cold night air. Then, suddenly, the bridge seemed to groan, the wood creaking as though someone else had just stepped onto it. The air grew colder, a chill so biting it felt like it was sinking into their bones. Do you feel that? Lucas whispered, his voice shaky. Anna forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. It's just the wind. But Jason wasn't looking at them anymore. His gaze was fixed on something out over the water. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with horror. Guys, look, he murmured, pointing a trembling finger toward the lake. Anna and Lucas turned, their flashlights barely cutting through the mist that had started to rise from the water. But in the fog, they could make out a figure, draped in tattered, wet fabric, her hair long and dark, hanging in strands over her face. She was standing on the water as if it were solid ground, her head cocked to the side as she stared at them. Is this a joke? Lucas stammered, backing away from the edge. Jason shook his head, his hand gripping the edge of the bridge so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't think so. The woman began to move, gliding toward them, her movements slow and fluid as if she were floating. The air grew colder, and their breath came out in panicked clouds. Anna's skepticism vanished, replaced with sheer terror as the figure reached the bridge, her head tilting slowly up to reveal pale, empty eyes like twin voids that seemed to devour the light. She opened her mouth, and a rasping, echoing voice filled the air. Come closer. I've been waiting for so long. Jason, paralyzed by fear, stumbled backward, dropping the GoPro onto the bridge. Anna and Lucas grabbed him, trying to pull him back, but his gaze was locked on the woman's face, unable to look away. I see you, she whispered, her voice slithering around them. Come to me. With a sudden lurch, the figure stretched out her hand, fingers long and twisted, reaching out for Jason. His eyes glazed over as if in a trance, and he took a step forward, closer to the edge. Jason, no? Anna screamed, grabbing his arm, but his strength was unnatural, almost as though he were being pulled by an invisible force. Lucas grabbed his other arm, both of them pulling him back with all their strength, but the Lady of the Lake kept whispering, her eyes fixed on Jason, her hand inches away. With one last pull, Anna and Lucas managed to yank Jason back from the edge. They stumbled, all 3 of them falling onto the bridge's wooden planks, gasping for breath. When they looked back up, the Lady of the Lake was gone. The mist had started to clear, and the water lay calm and dark below them as if nothing had happened. Jason sat there shaking, unable to speak. His face was pale, and his eyes were distant, staring off into the night. We need to go. Now, Anna whispered, her voice barely holding steady. Lucas nodded, pulling Jason to his feet. The 3 of them stumbled back down the bridge, their steps frantic and hurried, leaving the abandoned GoPro lying on the wooden planks. They didn't speak as they walked back to town, their hearts still racing. The silence was thick, each of them replaying the night's events in their minds. When they reached the edge of town, Jason finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. She was calling me. I felt her, in my mind, pulling me closer. Don't talk about it, Anna snapped, her voice trembling. Let's just forget it ever happened. They each went home that night, trying to convince themselves it was just a trick of the fog, a shared hallucination brought on by their own nerves. But the nightmares started almost immediately. Each of them dreamed of the Lady of the Lake, her empty eyes, her twisted smile, calling them back to the bridge. A week later, Lucas disappeared. His parents found his bed empty, his phone left on his nightstand. A search party combed through the woods around Hollowbrook, but there was no trace of him. A few days after that, Anna went missing too. Her car was found abandoned near the bridge, the driver's side door left wide open. Jason was the only one left. He barricaded himself in his room, refusing to sleep, but the nightmares persisted, the lady's voice growing louder every night, her whisper echoing in his mind. On the anniversary of Halloween, his parents found his room empty, the window open, curtains blowing in the wind. Down by Hollowbrook Bridge, they found his shoes, neatly placed at the edge of the water. No one crosses the bridge at night anymore. And on foggy nights, locals say they sometimes hear faint whispers on the wind, calling out for someone to come closer, to look into the water, to join the Lady of the Lake forever.